I'm sorry, if I could just, I'm sorry, I just wanted to chime in on your question around engagement of participants in services. And we do see that this use of motivational interviewing and voluntary services tends to actually be much more successful than requiring somebody to participate in services. We see over 90% participation in services and generally in supportive housing programs. And we can certainly provide those data to the committee.
Early.
Running off to a 4 o'clock meeting, but I
Go ahead.
really appreciate the discussion. It's part of a really exciting couple days with regards to the state taking very seriously the issue of homelessness, and I'm sure everyone here was aware of the Senate's proposal yesterday. I just wanted to ask a little bit about the process. Is there some of this has been alluded to a bit, but I'd love to get a sense of the extent to which the fact that a developer is a nonprofit or for-profit, is that taken into account? Does that make any difference in the application process? Is there how much time and energy is looked at the extent to which a developer or a provider may have worked veteran serving capacity in the past? How are we ensuring or looking at track record in this particular area? I'd just love to get a better sense of how that's taken into account in the application process.
All right, so I'll attack the lead service provider, and I'll leave Susan to attack the developer side of it. On the lead service provider, we do look specifically at experience. You've heard a little testimony about it, trying to narrow in on, are you serving veterans or not, to garner this experience, as well as do you have experience in providing intensive case management and social service type programs through a supportive housing model or a transitional housing model. And then we have a very robust service plan requirement that the lead service provider needs to provide us with, telling us exactly how they're going to provide services and how are they going to budget them. And it gets into whether or not they're providing these evidence-based model types of service provision as well.
Clarify, the round 2 applications are already all in? Is there?
Yes.
So that's done. Okay. And is there a round 3? What's the timeline on that? That's May?
If we are getting our schedule on structure, which I'm not certain I'm ready to make that a firm commitment, we're trying to. We'll be releasing in the second quarter of the year.
And one of the things I heard with round 1 is there was a sense that it was a very condensed timeline. Do you expect the timeline for the next round, for example, to be a little more relaxed? Have you heard these kinds of concerns from your applicants?
We did hear those concerns in the round 1. We recognized that and knew when we put them out that it was going to be condensed. We tried to provide more time, and we did do that in round 2. And if we can get our schedule confirmed, which looking at programmatic changes takes time and policy, and we're trying to get ourselves to that. So we're hopeful that in round 3 we'll be able to provide a typical to the application process timeline for this sort of a process.
I think that the key here is that a development sponsor typically has a development in the queue for at a minimum 18 months, 24
Right.
months, 36 months. And so when we bring in a new program that has new requirements, in order for them to go back and retrofit the funding sources, the types of units, the type of population being addressed, that takes a while, and especially because we were forcing new marriages, between service providers and case managers and the development community. And so because it was such a condensed process, and the developments that came in round 1 and probably in round 2 had been in the queue for quite some time, they needed to be able to absorb the new requirements. And so I think as the program goes along, they'll have more of an ability, especially if the program requirements stay relatively consistent, to kind of absorb the new requirements and determine whether or not, as they are determining the feasibility of the project, whether they want to integrate VHHP into their project.
And on this for-profit, nonprofit, is that
No,
doesn't matter.
there's no consideration.
And just my final follow-up on Ms. Gunn's comment, you know, is there, so there's, on the one side of me says we really want to make sure that there's a very strong track record with veteran service and homeless service. At the same time, is there enough flexibility to allow, you know, new entrants into the market, and how do you balance that need?
And we're continuing to try and find a better resolution. As you heard, many people are
Yeah.
concerned about it. We're open to suggestions, but we keep looking for a better balance. We offer within this that if you don't have a clientele that reaches that 20% threshold, and it's not restricted beds, as kept saying, it's 20% of the clients you just generally serve, are they veterans or not? Thinking that if a fifth of your business is in a veteran population, you're going to develop some expertise in that. But if you don't have that, then there are agencies out there that do, and we are encouraging partnering to try and spread that wealth of knowledge, because we think that it should be spread, and we're trying to figure out how to do that better.
Rakowski.
I guess I have some of the concerns about the veteranness that it seems that you're putting on, or the emphasis for these problems that they have. I mean, somebody who's been homeless for 30 years, or is schizophrenic, or was raped in the military or outside the military, they have service needs. And by putting this false 20% goal, although I've heard from everybody here and I've listened to it, I think that rigidity is not doing the public a service, particularly the 24% of the homeless veterans that are living here in California. Well, we have if San Jose's representative was right, 4,000 people, that'd be 160,000 homeless people, because San Jose's got 1/40 of the state's population. So I don't know about the numbers on any given night, but I'd like to hear you flesh out a little bit more, because yes, I mean, some people, just because you're a veteran doesn't mean that the homeless problem or the homelessness or your schizophrenia is warranted for this. I guess what I see is a very rigid standard when we got a big problem here, and these funders are trying to clobber together projects here, and we've all served at local government, and it's a really hard thing to do.
We were just sidebarring about that exact thing when we were over here, but I think it goes both ways. We have service providers that are very familiar with serving our chronically homeless, and they know how to approach those populations, they know how to deal with those populations, they know how to bring them in off of the streets. And then we have veteran service providers, and what we are trying to do is marry those two. Can you, chronically homeless service providers, get some cultural competencies in military, and can you, military and veteran service providers, get some competencies in how to serve the chronically homeless? And so if we can bring those two experiences together, we'll have a bigger pool of service providers. And so we have been having those ongoing conversations.
And I'd like to add one more on there. I know that there's a lot of discussion about this 20%, and I'm really responding to your rigidity on it, trying to help put this in perspective. That 20% is for 6 points out of 133 points in this whole process, which if we get a really strong competition where we have fantastic, stellar applications, I agree that makes a difference in our second round, which we haven't finished scoring. I'm not certain it did not make a difference in the first round. I'm not certain that it will here in the second round, but I might be able to tell you better on that come February. But we are cognizant of it, and we're trying to balance.
I don't question anybody's goodwill. I just would remind everybody, if we go back to 2008 on the original Prop 12, I do bankruptcy work. That's what I do. Anybody who had a pulse was getting a loan in 2007, beginning of 2008, right? I mean, when we first passed the $900 million bond, I mean, everybody was getting home loans, and the public in June went out and said, we want another $900 million just for veterans to buy homes. And I don't know that there was that problem, but obviously we've realized that, wow, we don't need a single family house to help out people. We've got an acute problem with our homeless population and the services that need to be provided. So I hope we all, again, I voted for it, so I get it, I'm buying in, but we need to change some of the ideas that we had when we got here from after the hearing. So thank you, Mr. Chairs.
I had a general question that relates to tax credits. The governor vetoed all the housing tax credit bills this year. Okay? So he said, I'm going to veto these bills, and I want you to look at these in the budget process, which is, by the way, coming up next week. So we're going to start to, you know. And one of the tax credit bills was in the Assembly, housing tax credit, and then there was a bill that was in the Senate that the chair authored. He vetoed that one. That one, all that one did was allow the federal government income tax to be released, so people wouldn't have to, developers wouldn't have to ensnare their housing financing in the federal income tax when they use a tax credit. No money from the general fund, Mr. Vice Chair of the Budget Committee. So it was like, and we all voted for it. It was like a bipartisan thing. It went to the governor and he vetoed it. I want to know, can these tax credit, is there any tax credit bills that could be married with the housing finance of these projects that would benefit, how would that benefit these projects? From the developer's standpoint?
They base some of their financing on these.
Yeah,
credits.
that's why I'm asking. Would these tax credits, there was two bills, and I'm sure you folks are very aware of those bills. So how would those bills benefit these, and how would we be able to stretch the dollars more, provide the gap financing with the tax credits? Please, I'd like to hear some testimony on that.
First, I think that's a really good question.
Well, I'm asking
Second,
it.
in my opinion, I think AB 34, was that the 35?
Yeah, that
the
was
state
David
tax
Chu's
credit
bill in the Assembly.
I think that
Assemblyman.
that was the piece of legislation that I was watching most closely. last year.
35,
I think it would have
maybe 35.
created a vehicle that marries really well with not just VHHP, but also the Affordable Housing Sustainable Community Funds, which are all geared towards trying to get projects to use 4% tax credits, which are the non-competitive credits. And those credits are valued roughly 30% of what the other low-income housing tax credit program, the 9% program, yields in terms of equity. And it would have allowed you to utilize state credits to sort of help bridge that gap and make those projects more financially feasible. And I think it would have generated a significant amount of affordable housing in the state, and it's a real shame that it got vetoed.
Additionally, currently our current program is we also have state tax credits that pair with the 9% under the special needs set aside. So the problem is there's not enough state tax credit resources to fill the gap for both the 9% special needs as well as the 4%. And under the current HUD guidelines, the state of California is going to be losing what's called their difficult to develop areas, which allows for a federal boost in the state tax credit, the 9% tax credit as well as the 4%. So by losing that, we've lost sort of essentially federal resources.
Right.
So the state tax credit would help to pair that. Now, most of these projects, because of the deep level of affordability under the VHHP program, many of them are trying to achieve 9% tax credits. And so as we all know, those are very, very competitive. So the timing of that is harder to predict because in some cases you're going back 2 or 3, sometimes 4 times trying to win your 9% credits, whereas the 4% is over the counter, essentially. It's non-competitive. But there's not enough of a gap to fund the difference. And one of the things I wanted to continue to underscore, we talked about the service gaps, that we don't have enough money for social services in the supportive housing, but coupled with that, we don't have enough money for operating these buildings. When we deeply target these units at 30%, in many cases, we're doing a project now that residents are paying $200 a month to live in brand new apartments. That doesn't cover the cost of lights. That doesn't cover the cost of insurance. So we have not only the service gap, we have an operating gap when we are dealing with trying to serve the chronically homeless. And so both of those things require gap funding, and that could be helped by the state.
Everybody's talking about, oh, we got to have more money for housing, but then we had a essentially, I think, were all the tax credit bills last year, it was almost $1 billion worth of funding for housing, and then it got vetoed. And why give the money to the federal government? For, if you want the money to stay in a housing project in California, and then it has a multiplier effect, doesn't it? In terms of attracting investment and making the housing project work, so you can actually build the housing. So I think this is very important, and we'll be watching the budget next week very closely to see if this budget addresses this issue, because I think it's very important. And I would urge the governor to, put, as he said in the veto matches, deal with this issue in the budget, so that we can discuss this in the budget process.
I would just add that both AB 35 and SB 377 would have, for every dollar invested by the state, $2 would have been brought into the state by the federal government and federal tax credit resources. So we did lose pretty much $2 for each dollar we would have invested. It is, I agree, it's a shame that didn't pass or didn't get signed. But I am hoping that this year will be a little different, and we'll be able to get some more resources for housing that could bring in federal investment.
Thank you. We're going to keep trying on that and trying to dialogue with the governor, and hopefully we'll, Senator Nielsen.
Well, it's part of my question too, Mr. Chairman here. Some of these applications that have come in this particular tranche, totaling about 125 million, but they're basing it on these tax credits, part of them. And it's kind of a shaky straw house, because that's not a really reliable base. And also, some of them are based on local government funding. And I think I've never served in local government, but I've been the champion of it forever, and I don't think local governments are very whole and safe right now. Certainly the counties are not. A lot of cities are not very comfortable either. So can anybody tell me how that's a pretty good basis to build this based on? I just don't see it. I think that's pretty shaky, isn't it?
Anybody want to respond to that? I could make my own.
I will real fast. It is a shaky proposition. I think all of it is a house of cards until you actually start putting sticks and bricks together and building something and cementing it. I think, as you've heard, there is a strong commitment from this community to run through the gauntlet to try to bring all these sources together. And as you can see, it's sticky. It's not easy. None of these are continuing, yet these obligations and restrictions. We all know that there's a lot of goals, and we're putting it into every little bit of this. Yet, I have to say, we need some flexibility so that we can attract additional funding, we can fill additional gaps, because we only know what we know at this time when we get these things financed. What ends up happening down the road is the building inspector says, oh, by the way, now you need to add another $1 million to the cost. And then boom, you got a big hole again. So part of the challenge is we're grappling with a lot of things that are changing, but we also need to find some flexibility that will allow us a little pressure valve so that we can find additional funds to attract to bring this project to fruition. With the loss of redevelopment, that was a big blow, and we haven't been able to replace that. The perm source wasn't able to be fulfilled. And part of that is we need that other piece to make these projects whole. And I think we're all doing everything that we can to bring these things to fruition, but I think at the same time, we do need to think outside the box and find ways, if there are some restrictions, for example, that we could lighten, that would help us. For example, we have the goal of $10,000 per unit for services, but at the same time, the operating budget's limited, that the cash flow can only pay for $7,000 of that. So, maybe there's things that we can align that can kind of help us solve those problems, but it's going to take, I don't think it's one solid move. I think it's a lot of different moves, whether it's additional funding through the budget, whether it's some relief in how we look at the regulatory requirements under this program, and pair it well with some of the other resources that are out there.
Well, these are part of the guidelines. Now, how are these guidelines? Are they all finalized now? Are they set forth in regulations already? Are the guidelines still being developed?
But the applications that just came in for the round 2, the guidelines are established. I mean, we'll continue the evaluation process.
Are they established in regulation now?
This is all, it's all regulatory. It's not statutory. The more specific guidelines, much of which has been discussed today.
HCD has the flexibility of doing guidelines as opposed to regulations. And so there's a process which gives it a little more flexibility, and they're able to more expeditiously make those changes. And so we have the flexibility because when you so eloquently put the legislation together, you allowed us to do it via guidelines as opposed to via regulation. So we do have some flexibility to be able to make quick changes.
Another question I had was that we have a great housing program for homeless veterans. It's when they don't get any housing and they're homeless and they have all these social, psychological issues. It's called the county jail and the state prison, okay? That's what the housing program is called. And yesterday we talked about the No Place Like Home initiative, where we're going to take the Mental Health Services Act funding programs, and we found out that we spent $110,000 a year on a mentally ill person in the state prison system. Does not include their health care cost, but just to incarcerate them. And it's getting bigger and bigger and more expensive and more expensive. I visited 19 prisons, and they have great health care. I mean, they have, like I went to Death Row, they have a 3-hour wait time for mental health services. I mean, you know, pretty good, right? 3 hours after you claim you have a problem, you get services, 3 hours. So what's, you know, so the No Place Like Home initiative that our leadership in the Senate is talking about will cut down on the alternative we have to doing these housing programs, which is, in a lot of cases, the state prison and the county jail where people, and of course the emergency room is another housing. You know, I chaired the hospital committee in our county. It was like just walking in the door in the emergency room is like $2,000, $2.5 grand, just walking for one day. So if that's a cost savings, are there other areas that are offsetting the fiscal cost to the counties that they can repurpose some of these dollars to housing first models? And I want your opinion on that. Does that really work? Can you give us how it applies to veterans, and is that a model that works?
I think a couple years ago, and somebody else may want to chime in as well, I think two years ago, I believe this legislature passed a pilot project for social impact bonds,
Yeah, right.
specifically for reintegrating, former, it's for reentry of folks coming out from the criminal justice system. And so I don't think that there's any data yet from that program, but I know that they're in the process of implementing the pilot program now, and so we should be probably getting data relatively soon.
I'm kind of like, based on my kind of theory about this, it's not really a theory. Once you get in the criminal justice system, the cash register goes crazy, right? It costs so much money, you know? So you go through
Amen.
the judges, the DAs,
But
the
we still need it.
the
We
jail.
need our
Yeah, we need it,
incarceration.
but-
We
but
need
it- But it does
prisons.
cost, yeah, I know, I don't disagree. But it costs a lot of money. So the idea is to intervene and get them into the housing first model. That's what the housing first model is the purposes of it, is to divert before they go into the criminal justice system and provide those necessary services. And we don't want veterans in our prisons. We have them in there now. I mean, there's probably more veterans in the prison right now in California than there is in any of all your housing combined, to be honest about it. That's probably a true statement. So we don't want them there. We want them in these homes where they can have a rehabilitative services.
If I may, I can't speak to whether or not the cost savings are being redirected into Housing First or other models locally, but I can tell you that the state of California benefits from having, at last count, I think about 22 or 24 veterans treatment courts, where we have VA and other community partners and judges obviously dedicated to diverting veterans from incarceration. We also do prison and jail outreach and partner with veteran service organizations and CalVet and others to work with that population. So that's been an ongoing project for a number of years. But I haven't heard whether or not those savings have been then rediverted to other housing
Judges in
programs.
my county are telling me they have people that have gone through those courts that have been assigned to be put into rehabilitative housing programs